When President Donald Trump slapped punitive tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, copper, automobiles, and a sweeping 35% levy on all Canadian goods, he expected submission. It was economic pressure meant to bend Canada to the will of a more powerful neighbor. But instead of caving, Canada responded with precision, strategy, and a long game that may have rewritten the playbook on modern economic resistance. What Trump viewed as a winning move, a muscle-flexing gesture to extract concessions, became the catalyst for a deeper transformation inside Canada's economy and diplomatic posture. And while the U.S. administration escalated for headlines and optics, Canada moved quietly, systematically, and perhaps most importantly, collectively. It was not just a policy response. It was a national one.
If you're done watching corrupt elites rig the system and leave you behind, subscribe now. If you want real talk, raw truth, and zero spin, this is your channel. If you're ready to fight back, hit that subscribe button and stand with us.
Canada's silent retaliation. Unlike previous trade disputes where countries counterpunch with matching tariffs, Canada chose a different route. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada refused to engage in a tariff-for-tariff slugfest. Instead, they began dismantling the very economic dependency Trump was trying to exploit. Their response was rooted in three principles: resilience, diversification, and autonomy. They launched trade missions across Asia and Europe, fast-tracked regulatory harmonization talks with non-U.S. partners, and quietly began redirecting supply chains. Within months, Canadian export patterns began shifting. Trade with Germany, Japan, and South Korea rose sharply, and exports to the U.S. dropped, not as a reaction, but as a choice. The message was clear. Canada would no longer allow itself to be cornered by a single volatile partner. And in rejecting retaliation, they didn't look weak, they looked sovereign. Supply chain shock becomes catalyst. The 35% tariff, applied broadly and without nuance, disrupted more than trade flows. It affected real lives. In Toronto, reports of grounded air ambulances due to delayed U.S. parts deliveries shocked the public and the political class. The chaos served as an inflection point. What was once seen as a trade disagreement morphed into a question of national security and public well-being. Canadian politicians, CEOs, and unions, rarely aligned, stood together in outrage. Ontario Premier Doug Ford condemned the tariffs as an economic shakedown. UniFirst president warned of mass job losses if industries caved to the pressure to relocate south. These weren't empty slogans. They were warnings backed by evidence, and Canadians took them seriously. The Ford-Carney axis. Doug Ford, known for populist conservatism, and Mark Carney, an elite technocrat with global central banking credentials, made an unlikely pair. But their unity, along with support from provincial leaders and business groups, signaled a new front in Canada's internal cohesion. Together, they began crafting a narrative that transcended partisanship. The idea that Canada must no longer play junior partner to an unpredictable neighbor. Ford pushed for supply chain repatriation. Carney pursued new trade architecture. The result? An increasingly self-reliant Canadian economy that no longer looked to Washington for economic direction, but inward, to its own talent, infrastructure, and markets. Energy and infrastructure, Canada's long game. One of the most significant retaliatory moves didn't come in the form of tariffs. It came in the form of concrete and steel. Canada accelerated infrastructure projects linking energy resources in Alberta to ports in British Columbia and Manitoba. Pipelines, railways, and logistics hubs were greenlit to reroute exports toward Asia. These moves weren't just economic. They were strategic acts of liberation from a geographic and economic choke point. In Nova Scotia, LNG terminals began upgrading with the intent of serving the European market. In Quebec, new regulations fast-tracked green tech partnerships with French and German firms. Canada wasn't waiting for the U.S. to re-engage in good faith. They were moving forward without them. A cultural shift by Canadian. Perhaps the most profound effect of the trade conflict was cultural. Canadians, known globally for politeness and pragmatism, got political. The Buy Canadian movement exploded. Domestic goods, once competing on price alone, became symbols of resilience. Consumers began choosing Canadian-made products, even when cheaper alternatives existed. It wasn't protectionism. It was patriotism. Small businesses reported surges in sales. Farmers formed cooperatives to reduce reliance on U.S. processing facilities. The economic boycott from below was subtle, but sustained. Unlike Trump's tariffs, which were top-down and transactional, Canada's cultural response was bottom-up and emotional, and arguably more durable. America's miscalculation. Trump's tariffs were designed as leverage, but they misread the room. The assumption was that economic pressure would splinter Canada internally, forcing industry to pressure Ottawa to capitulate. But the opposite happened. Trump's tactics united Canadian stakeholders who had rarely shared common ground before. Furthermore, U.S. manufacturers began voicing complaints to Washington. Car makers in Michigan, relying on Canadian parts, faced higher costs and slow production. Appliance makers reported delays. The tariffs, intended to punish Canada, ricocheted across the Rust Belt and Sun Belt alike. What began as a show of strength ended in a scramble to mitigate blowback. The global response, shifting alliances. Outside North America, countries watched closely. Japan and Germany fast-tracked negotiations with Canada. India and Brazil opened consulates in Calgary and Toronto to deepen trade cooperation. The message resonated. Canada was open for business, not as an alternative to the U.S., but as a partner defined by stability. Meanwhile, the U.S.'s unpredictability prompted a broader recalibration among allies. If Canada, a traditional friend, could be hit with arbitrary tariffs, who was safe? This led to quiet discussions in Brussels, Seoul, and Canberra about diversifying away from Washington, a diplomatic ripple effect that Washington had not anticipated. Carney's masterstroke, containment through stability. While Trump waged economic warfare in public, Carney used quiet containment. He didn't respond with bombast. He responded with vision. He met with EU leaders, signed tech-sharing agreements with Singapore, and restructured agricultural subsidies to protect farmers without violating WTO rules. He did it all while barely mentioning Trump's name. Carney's strategy wasn't just to outlast Trump, it was to outthink him. And by maintaining Canada's international credibility, he ensured that when the dust settled, Canada would stand as a nation that chose stability over spectacle. The U.S. faces the consequences. By the time U.S. officials returned to the negotiating table, they found a Canada that was no longer the same country they had tried to pressure months earlier. Canada had new partners, new trade routes, a population that had shifted politically and economically toward independence, and a leadership class no longer interested in symbolic friendship, but in measurable, reciprocal value. The U.S. hadn't just lost a negotiation, they had lost influence. Trump's tariffs were supposed to corner Canada. Instead, they liberated it. What followed was not retaliation in kind, but transformation in kind. Canada used the pressure not as an excuse to capitulate, but as a reason to reimagine its economy. The result was not just survival, it was rebirth. Canada quietly strengthened its financial safeguards during the trade conflict. Under Carney's leadership, the Bank of Canada conducted stress tests on key sectors, particularly manufacturing and energy, to withstand fluctuations in FX and access to credit. Regulatory bodies also eased requirements temporarily on small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, ensuring liquidity and preventing a credit crunch that could have amplified the effects of American tariffs. These prudent measures helped inoculate the economy against panic, a stark contrast to the turbulence across the border. While much attention focused on steel and energy, Canada advanced a parallel track in innovation diplomacy. High-level delegations traveled to Tokyo, Stockholm, and Frankfurt, securing pilot programs in AI, cleantech, and biotech. Memorandums of understanding were signed with European research institutes, giving Canadian startups privileged access to joint R&D funding and EU regulatory sandboxes. This strategic pivot not only diversified Canada's tech partnerships, but also elevated its global reputation as a reliable incubator for innovation. Facing pressure from potential manufacturing relocation, Canada launched a National Skills Resilience Fund. This initiative provided retraining and apprenticeship grants for workers in affected sectors like automotive tooling and metal fabrication. In coordination with provinces, Carney's government worked with educational institutions to fast-track credentials in advanced manufacturing and green energy. The result? Canadian workers were positioned to remain productive, reducing the political pressure that tariff threats aimed to exploit. In a deft geopolitical move, Canada turned its attention to Latin America. Trade representatives reopened offices in Sao Paulo and Mexico City, launching the LATAM Canada Trade Accelerator Plan. Canadian farmers gained better access to Brazilian soy and Argentinian wheat markets, while Canadian mining companies secured partnerships for mineral exploration in Chile and Peru. This widening of trade horizons further distanced Canada from a U.S.-centric economic orbit. Canada secured 2 major political risk insurance packages from multilateral agencies. This move offered Canadian exporters protection against expropriation, embargo, or trade retaliation, even if the United States chose to escalate tariffs. By underwriting this layer of financial shielding, the Canadian government gave businesses the confidence to pursue U.S. market opportunities without fearing sudden shutdown. To the alarm of American businesses, Canadian households shifted behavior. Surveys showed a sharp rise in domestic brand loyalty, not out of nationalism, but pragmatism. A study from a Canadian Consumer Council revealed a 40% increase in purchases from local grocery suppliers, wood product makers, and boutique manufacturers. This consumer-side realignment sent a signal that went beyond economics. Canada's identity was evolving. Simultaneously, Canada's creative industries saw an unexpected rebound, with trade tensions escalating. Streaming platforms and film festivals increasingly saw Canadian content. Domestic filmmakers, animators, and game developers signed partnerships across Europe, benefiting from grants and promotional support. What began as an act of economic diversification found resonance in culture. Canada's soft power expanded just when it was most needed. The U.S. business community slowly turned inward. Auto parts firms in Michigan formed a coalition urging the administration to ease tariffs. Appliance manufacturers in Tennessee reported rising production costs. American CEOs testified to Congress, warning that continued tariffs would do more harm than good, echoing Carney's message, but through American voices. France, Germany, and the Netherlands responded to Canada's diversification by tapping into the new supply corridors. European manufacturers began sourcing from Alberta tar sands derivatives, or Canadian grain shipments diverted through Hamburg instead of New York. The common European reaction: insistence on Canada's reliability and auditable customization of supply contracts to avoid U.S. entanglements. A coalition of non-aligned countries launched a trade tribunal, offering arbitration services to nations hit by unilateral tariffs, explicitly mentioning Canada-U.S. burdens, but without targeting any party. The rhetoric: trade integrity must be upheld. Canada helped seed the initiative, highlighting its leverage in the diplomatic arms race, even as it outwardly professed no animosity. When U.S. defense procurement threatened to penalize Canadian defense firms, Canada leveraged NATO partnerships to elevate domestic military contracts. Major Canadian aerospace and technology firms won R&D roles in Europe, deflecting both past U.S. reliance and building fresh capabilities for the Royal Canadian Air Force. Canada showcased its smart tariff model through international forums, a proposed structure for minimal impact protectionism, tariffs that apply only when domestic capacity exceeds 90%, with automatic sunset clauses. This concept was crafted in response to Trump's sweeping approach, which was widely criticized as blunt and destructive. Canada used its seat on the G20 finance track to propose a fair tariff code, which would require transparency, proportionality, and dispute resolution mechanisms. While the U.S. abstained, European and G20 allies expressed support. Carney's push positioned Canada as a leader in global trade reform, even as he avoided direct confrontation with Washington. Tariff fatigue grew within the U.S. electorate. Internal polling, not publicized, showed declines in Trump support in swing states like Wisconsin and Ohio. Industry groups applied pressure. Some state governments threatened tariffs on lumber for U.S. use of Canadian pulp. Trump's leverage began to evaporate amid domestic political reality. Finally, Canada opened a new diplomatic channel, a strategic belief compact, with key U.S. congressional leaders. Though they avoided mention of tariffs, the compact reaffirmed shared values, legal systems, and security cooperation. The aim: to preserve underlying trust, even as trade flames burned. When faced with Trump's unprecedented 35% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the United States, Canada could have responded with blunt retaliation. Instead, they chose surgical precision. Ottawa unveiled a list of countermeasures. Carefully crafted tariffs targeting politically sensitive sectors in key American states. It wasn't just a response, it was a message, and Washington heard it loud and clear. Canada's retaliatory tariffs zeroed in on ketchup from Ohio, orange juice from Florida, motorcycles from Wisconsin, and construction equipment from Illinois. These weren't random. They were laser targeted to hit industries in swing states critical to Trump's re-election bid. The idea was simple. If you want to wage economic war, expect consequences at the ballot box. At the same time, Canada imposed non-tariff barriers that quietly slowed down American imports through customs inspection delays, new packaging regulations, and altered product certifications. These bureaucratic tools were invisible to the average consumer, but maddeningly effective for American exporters. Supply chain sabotage? No, supply chain evolution. Rather than descend into an all-out trade war, Canada initiated what economists described as a soft supply chain decoupling. They didn't sabotage the North American economy. They evolved their role within it. Canadian firms began moving away from North American production dependencies, gradually sourcing parts from Europe, Japan, South Korea, and emerging Asian economies. This pivot was supported by federal grants, tax credits, and fast-track approvals for logistics infrastructure projects at Pacific ports and inland rail hubs. The Canadian Pacific and CN Rail quietly expanded cargo capacity westward, opening new trade routes that bypass American customs choke points entirely. It was economic insulation, not isolation. And it worked. Provincial alignment, the rise of the interprovincial bloc. One of the most underappreciated developments during the trade standoff was the rise of interprovincial economic coordination. For decades, Canada's provinces often acted like isolated economic units. That changed under Carney's leadership. Premiers in Alberta, Ontario, British Columbia, and Quebec formed a new Economic Security Council, designed to streamline interprovincial trade and investment. Infrastructure projects that had once been delayed by bureaucratic overlap or political infighting were suddenly prioritized. Regulatory red tape between provinces was slashed. A common procurement framework was introduced, boosting buying power for Canadian-made goods and reducing internal friction. In effect, Canada became less dependent on its southern neighbor by becoming more dependent on itself. Digital trade, Canada's quiet leap forward. While Trump was focused on manufacturing and tariffs, Canada was quietly re-engineering its digital economy. The government passed a comprehensive digital trade framework, setting clear rules on cross-border data flows, cloud computing regulations, and digital IP protections. These reforms weren't just domestic housekeeping. They were designed to attract international tech firms wary of the regulatory chaos in the United States. Several mid-sized European and Asian tech companies relocated North American headquarters to Canada, citing regulatory clarity and political neutrality as key factors. Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal began to emerge as mini tech hubs, not threatening Silicon Valley, but building a distinct alternative for digital commerce. The energy pivot, exporting more than oil. Canada's energy sector also pivoted, not away from oil, but toward a more diversified energy export model. LNG terminals in British Columbia accelerated their timelines, aimed at delivering liquefied natural gas to Asia, bypassing U.S. Gulf ports entirely. Equally important was Canada's massive investment in battery-grade critical minerals, nickel, cobalt, and lithium, needed for the global EV boom. While the U.S. fumbled with protection supply chain politics, Canada partnered with Europe and Japan to create joint mining ventures and refining facilities. In doing so, Canada transformed its role from oil supplier to America into energy security partner to the world. Trump's gamble backfires domestically. Back in Washington, the political backlash began to simmer. American farmers hit by retaliatory tariffs found themselves locked out of Canadian markets. Small manufacturers who relied on Canadian aluminum and components for competitive pricing suddenly faced cost spikes that threatened their margins and their payrolls. Congressional leaders from both parties began pressuring the White House to revisit its blanket tariff policy. The rhetoric in U.S. media slowly shifted, from Canada is bluffing to Trump miscalculated. By late summer, several governors publicly broke with the president, warning that the tariff war with Canada was hurting American workers more than it was helping. Canada gained soft power on the global stage. For many observers, Canada's response became a blueprint for how smaller and mid-sized nations could stand their ground against an unpredictable superpower, not through threats or spectacle, but through coordination, economic clarity, and diplomatic resilience. At the WTO, Canada presented a paper outlining a modern framework for retaliatory mechanisms in asymmetric trade relationships. It didn't name the United States, but the subtext was clear. The proposal drew praise from Scandinavian countries, the EU, and parts of Southeast Asia. Canada had positioned itself not just as a victim of trade aggression, but as an architect of global economic reform, a cultural shift in Canadian economic identity. The conflict also sparked a shift in how Canadians viewed their own economic destiny. National polling showed rising public support for reducing dependency on the U.S. market, even if it meant short-term pain. Self-sufficiency and economic sovereignty entered the political lexicon in ways they hadn't since the post-World War II era. For the first time in decades, Canadian media ran editorials questioning the wisdom of a one-sided trade alliance with the United States. Think tanks across Ottawa and Toronto published white papers advocating for a new Canadian doctrine, one that prioritized multi-market engagement, economic self-reliance, and domestic innovation over geographic convenience. When the much-hyped July 21st deadline arrived, there was no deal, and there was no panic. Canada had spent the prior 6 weeks building diplomatic alternatives, economic insulation, and political consensus. Trump, by contrast, was facing growing dissent within his own administration and backlash from Republican lawmakers. By early August, American trade officials signaled a willingness to revisit the tariff structure, privately acknowledging that Canada's resilience had outlasted the pressure campaign. The eventual outcome was not a grand bargain or a public apology, but quiet rollback of tariffs on certain sectors, dressed up as temporary suspensions. In reality, it was a retreat. The trade war with Trump's America was never just about tariffs. It was a stress test for Canada's maturity as a global economic actor. What emerged was a country more unified across provinces, more confident in its industrial capabilities, and more diversified in its trade partnerships than ever before.